Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Paul Golan. I'm executive director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, and this is the second episode of our new Rabbis Cantors monthly series, the Parsha of the Month Club. I come up with awful titles for our series, but I know that this is going to be a fun and interesting conversation. As always, I'll give my little spiel that this is a members only program for folks who are either members of an affiliated community of the Society for Humanistic Judaism or independent members directly of the Society for Humanistic Judaism as a kind of thank you for your support. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, and that means we rely on donations and membership. Our membership only covers less than half our budget. So we really do rely on additional donations from our members and other supporters. And as the year comes to an end, I don't know if you're like me, but I will sit down at some point between now and when the clock strikes midnight and start renewing all my memberships. I belong to about 30 different secular organizations. I could name them if you're looking for organizations to give to as well. It's not a zero-sum game, but I hope you will also consider the Society for Humanistic Judaism in your end of year giving. But as members and supporters and donors, it means so much to us. So thank you for your ongoing support. Today, we will be hearing from Rabbi Jeremy Kridel. He is the rabbi at Machar. He joined Machar in July of 2017 and added the role of director of Machar's Jewish Cultural School in 2021. Jeremy studied for the rabbinate at the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism. He has a bachelor's and master's of arts degree in religion from Florida State University, where he focused on Jewish studies and biblical interpretation and earned a Juris Doctor degree at the Indiana University Maurer School of Law in Bloomington, Indiana. Jeremy has worked as an adult Jewish educator, has taught biblical Hebrew at the university level, and has taught seventh graders on the Holocaust, the history of the modern state of Israel, and comparative Judaism. Before working within the secular humanistic Jewish movement, he worked as a lawyer in Indiana and taught law at the Indiana University Kelley School of Business in Indianapolis. In service of the broader humanistic Jewish movement, Jeremy serves on the governing boards of the Society for Humanistic Judaism and the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism, and has served as president of the Association of Humanistic Rabbis. He served as the editor for SHJ's quarterly Humanistic Judaism magazine, and he's also an accomplished musician, a husband, father, and lots more things. So if you never met Jeremy, I'm glad that you will be right now. And I will turn it over to you. I'm going to put the spotlight on you and have at it. Thanks very much.
So first of all, I feel like we should add into Paul's fundraising thing the note that no, you may not have a tote bag. This is not NPR or coffee mug or whatever it is. For those who are unfamiliar with NPR, it's National Public Radio here in the United States, and the fundraising drive always involves hit a certain amount and we'll send you a tote bag or a mug or whatever it is. So most farmers markets are basically exhibitions for NPR tote bags.
We'll
Jody's
we'll
laughing and
we'll
Paul's
send
laughing.
we'll send you a sticker though. We'll send you a sticker.
There you go. Stickers and magazines and all kinds of other things. So, um, I don't know how familiar people are with the Joseph story as a whole, right? It's kind of the longest continual narrative in Genesis. I saw someone claim it's the longest continual narrative in the Torah, and I think the Torah as a whole might want to say, but I'm the longest narrative of the Torah, and so maybe we shouldn't be measuring the length of anything these days. Um, Torah scrolls, stories, or whatever. Um, I guess unless you need it for a construction project. Um, one of the things I really like about the Joseph story is that you can treat it as its own narrative and you aren't as driven to do the things that we do with the early part of Genesis, where we start to piece apart sources and take things apart and go, well, this doesn't really make sense unless you think there are two narratives, right? We've got a pretty coherent story for the most part, but it has weird gaps. And I think the gaps are the interesting part, particularly at the beginning of the Joseph story. So, Paul, is the typical thing to summarize what's going on, or just
Yeah.
yeah?
Mhm.
Okay, so we are at the beginning of this is Parshat Vayeishev, so it's Genesis 37, and it starts off. These are it starts off saying that Jacob settles in the land of Canaan where his father had sojourned. These are the generations of Jacob. And then it says Joseph is 17 years old. And we're just kind of off to the races with a story about Joseph. And so if you are a Western reader, the first gap that happens is wait, how do we get from these are the generations of Jacob to Joseph is 17 years old? Because if you've already been reading, you know that Jacob or Israel or whatever you're calling him at this point has a bunch of other kids. So we already have a gap, right? And I called the program Leaping Lacunae mostly because why not do a Batman title kind of thing if you can get away with it? But also because there are these lacunae, these gaps. So we start off with a gap and we get the story that lots of us are familiar with from Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, or if you grew up at the right time in the right sort of place in the South in the United States, uh, Veggie Tales, or there's um, a Joseph story in the Veggie Tales, right? The cucumber, tomato, all those guys animated, dance around, sing songs, whatever. Um, it's a Western in that context, which makes a certain amount of sense. So we get the story of Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, right? That's
Oh, we
how.
had lots, so we don't have to get it. Yeah.
So we kind of have that bit going on, right? So we get this story, and there are gaps within the story too. And among them are who is doing what and what we know what the motivations are, but there's a lot of gaps in who's doing what. And it gets kind of complicated at a certain point, and we're not really sure who's doing what. When Joseph is finally going to be, he's the favorite of his father, and he acts like a child, we're told, and rats out on his brothers from other mothers, right? So Jacob is the father of all of these people, but there are four different mothers, depending on which of his children you're talking about in the story. And we get to the point where Jacob is sent out to go find his brothers. They are herding sheep near a town called Shechem. He says, Go. Jacob says, Go find your brothers, see how they're doing, see how the flock is doing, come back and tell me. And they see him approaching from a distance and they say, Hey, that dreamer, that guy who keeps talking about he's going to be better than us. We'll come back to some of the dreams because there's Freudian things abound in the dreams. Um, hey, that dreamer's coming. Let's get rid of him. And then one brother tries to kind of say, oh, let's just throw him in a pit because he thinks I'm going to come back later and get him. And he's tossed in a pit. Some people come along and pull him up out of the pit and take him to Egypt. And somebody gets money. It's not clear who's getting the money. And meanwhile, the brothers are trying to figure out now what. And finally, they go, oh, we'll just pretend like he's dead. Joseph is taken. Jacob is bereft. And then we get a whole other story because that's how the Torah rolls. And we get the story of Judah and Tamar, which has its own gaps. So the general story of Judah and Tamar, because you can get in the weeds, is Judah, one of Jacob's sons, has sons and he marries them into a neighboring tribe, and the first son dies. And so he marries his next son to the same person. He dies. Both of these boys do things that God doesn't like, we're told. So they both die, and Judah goes, oh my gosh, I can't let my remaining son marry this person because he'll die too. I'm just gonna send her away, tell her that she's a widow, be done with it. And then I'll promise her that she can marry the next son, with no intention of actually fulfilling, we can guess. She eventually finds out that the next son is old enough and knows that Judah's not fulfilling his promise, so she goes and pretends to be a prostitute until Judah encounters her. Judah has sex with her, impregnates her, and leaves behind some items that she requests. He doesn't know who she is. Leaves behind some items she requests that she can use to authenticate this is the person who actually came and impregnated me so that I can then ensure that I'm taken care of. This eventually happens. Judah realizes he's done something wrong and supports her in the manner in which I guess he thinks she should be supported, and admits his wrongdoing. And then we flash back to Joseph because that's how the Torah rolls again. And we now have Joseph in Potiphar's house. So Potiphar is the chief steward of sorts to Pharaoh. He's the prince of cooks, essentially. And Joseph is running the house. And Joseph is really pretty, we're told, over and over again. And Potiphar's wife falls in love with Joseph or decides that she wants to have sex with Joseph because he's just very pretty. And he says no over and over, and she strips his clothes off and he runs out into a common area and she says he tried to attack me, gets him thrown into jail. And then we have the story of Joseph and his ability to interpret dreams, although Joseph insists it's not his ability. And we get the story of a cook or a baker and Pharaoh's cupbearer, which, that's the guy who holds the cup of wine and also probably is responsible for sipping it to make sure it's not poisoned or, to make sure that it is poisoned, but Pharaoh doesn't get the poison. Seems like a high risk job. I don't know if I'd want it, but this is the way the ancient world worked. And each of them is put into jail with Joseph, and Joseph, whose managerial expertise is emphasized this whole time, Joseph says, "Oh, well, cupbearer, I have good news for you. This dream that you dreamed means that you're going back to Pharaoh. Baker, I have very bad news for you. This dream that you dreamed means that you are going to be executed. And both of these things are going to happen in 3 days' time." And they do. And he says to the cupbearer, "Hey, remember me when you get back up there, get me out of the pokey." And the cupbearer, of course, does not remember Joseph right away and does not get him out of the pokey. And the baker has the things happen to him that Joseph says will happen to the baker. So that's the basic story, right? And this is one of these things where you can see even when the Torah is telling one story, it's never telling just one story. It's kind of bouncing around back and forth. And we stopped in the middle because Vayeishev stops there and the next one picks up in the next week. And here we are with part of the Joseph story. And so these gaps that are in the narrative are what are really kind of the thing that I find really interesting. Um, and there are a lot of ways to deal with gaps, right? If we do just straight literary interpretation, we're prone to thinking of gaps as mistakes by the writer or as things that'll be filled in later, right? You've probably heard of the idea of Chekhov's gun, the idea that if you see a gun on the table in Act One, it better be used in Act Two if you're not doing anything with it right now. Um, Gaps can be that. Gaps can be intentional to leave some suspense. Gaps can be, we thought we plugged that gap and we didn't. Um, Gaps can be just inconsistencies. If you've gone to a Marvel movie, you've heard people yelling about the plot holes after the end of it. They can be those. But what's really interesting about some of the gaps in the Joseph story is that they also communicate priorities. What do we care about in the story? Because while there are lots of mistakes and things that you can see in the biblical text, the overall flow of the narrative is something that's been worked on over and over and over and over by redactors. right? Part of the reason it's hard to even know where sources are coming from in the Torah is because somebody did work to try to make it smooth. And so one of the first places we get a gap is the second verse where it says, this is the line of Jacob. Elah told Yaakov, these are the generations of Jacob. Joseph is 17 years old. And what do you do with what seems like a mistake? And I think part of what we should keep in mind is that maybe this isn't a mistake. Sometimes gaps aren't errors. They're telling you something. And in this case, I suspect what they're telling you is this is what we think is important right now. There's an idea that you will not be surprised to discover that Jews mostly don't subscribe to, even the Orthodox ones. Um, that is, I'm going to pronounce the German badly because I only took German for reading knowledge in grad school. I didn't take German for German's sake. Um, Salvationsgeschichte, which means salvation history, that part of the way you read the Bible in a Christian theological context is this is the history of the salvation of God's people. This is a little bit of Salvationsgeschichte, this jump, to say the important part of the story is not what these other 11 boys have been doing all this time, which we discover is herding sheep, but is what Joseph is up to. Joseph is the piece that runs the story forward. This is the important part of the lineage of Jacob. We're going to focus on it. And so it's not a mistake. And we sometimes are prone to treating these things as mysteries or as mistakes. And it's not the first time that the Torah has done this, that this is how the Noah story starts as well. That it's these are the generations of Noah. Noah was, rather than run through all of Noah's sons right now and all of the prior generations up to that point. So we get these gaps. And we start to get more gaps when we start to look at what happens to Joseph. So, Paul, am I able to do a share?
You should
Ah,
be
yes.
now.
Okay. So I'm sure lots of us have seen this website Safaria before. I'm not going to go extol the virtues of the virtual Jewish library that really does put my bookcases to shame, and that's fine. I don't need to own every printed book. Please, someone tell my spouse that I said I don't need to own every printed book on Judaism because she won't believe that I said it unless you report that back to her. Um, and so we're looking at this story, and we come across the part where the brothers are getting ready to toss Joseph into the pit. And they do it. And it says, looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Where is Gilead? Anybody actually know where Gilead is? Not the one from the book and from the TV series. It's the East Bank of the Jordan. Right. West Bank is the West Bank that we know about. The East Bank, way back when, was Gilead. So Ishmaelites are coming from Gilead. Ishmaelites are the Torah's word for Arabs, essentially. So Ishmaelites are coming from Gilead. They're camels with gum balm and laudanum. Ladanum, not laudanum. Laudanum's antipsychotic med. Sorry. Ladanum. Um, you might need some laudanum after this. I don't know. Um, and let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. He's our brother. We shouldn't kill him, but we can sell him and they'll do whatever. There are salt mines and things like that at this point in time. And salt mines are, if you ever read about salt mines are basically a death sentence in the ancient world. So let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. And then Midianite traders pass by, pull Joseph up out of the pit, and sell him to the Ishmaelites. And then Reuben goes back to the pit because his plan has been to save Joseph all along. And we get the whole story about a savage beast has devoured Joseph. And the Midianites, meanwhile, sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, a courtier of Pharaoh and his prefect. Where did the Midianites come from? Are they the same as the Ishmaelites? What's going on here? Right, so Martin says Midian is just south of Gilead. Yeah, essentially, it's farther down the Arabian Peninsula than where Gilead would have been. Um, they're both Semitic tribes, essentially kind of in the same place. So, did the Midianites pick him up and sell him to the Ishmaelites? It seems really clear in this English translation, which is your cue to recognize that I'm about to say it's not so clear in the Hebrew, right? Anytime anybody says the translation seems really clear, that's a good sign that we don't trust the translation. Um, and so this is really this verse that says, um, Midianite traders are passing by and they pull him up out of the pit and they sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver and they bring Joseph to Egypt. And it seems really clear, except Midianites and Ishmaelites, and where did the Midianites come from and what's happening? And it really isn't clear what's happening. And the rabbis weren't clear what was happening. And so it will probably not surprise you to discover that some of the rabbis think that the Midianites and the Ishmaelites are the same people. Because again, we have this gap. What's going on here? This verb, and they sold, could refer to anybody. It doesn't actually say the Midianites sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites. It says they sold him to the Ishmaelites. Who's they? Seems like it says Midianite traders, but who's they? We're left not knowing. And they're also Jacob's cousins. To the extent that Jacob has any recognition that they're his cousins, they kind of know, but um, so we get this back and forth with, is it Ishmaelites or is it Midianites? Because Midianites, it says the Midianites sold them to the Ishmaelites. The Midianites sold them in Egypt to Potiphar. Where'd the Midianites come from? All of a sudden, we've got actors shifting around, and it's not really clear from the text what's supposed to be happening. Who's selling whom to whom, and who's doing what? Because when we finally pick up with Joseph again, we have the story of Judah and Tamar. When we finally pick up with Joseph again, somebody's buying from Ishmaelites. And the question is, okay, wait, who's who? And do we think that this is a mistake? Or do we think that there's a gap trying to tell us something else? Um, and so this is one of these passages, this is one of these texts that I really like because it makes us, if you're really kind of paying attention, it makes you stop and ask some questions about how we write and what it means when you leave something open. Because whoever wrote this down thought the story was clear or clear enough. And so what do you do with that when the story is not clear? what do you do with that when the story's not clear in real life? Do we use judgment and just fill in the gaps? Do we make decisions with gaps? And this is one of those places that kind of points out there's a lot we don't know when we function around in the world and think we know an awful lot about what's going on. And so I always like this particular story because it prompts us to start filling in some gaps and to start thinking about what it means to act when you don't know everything. Because there's lots of other uncertainty here when we go looking at Reuben's plan. So his brother Reuben plans to rescue Joseph from the pit. And he's gone, and he says, what am I supposed to do? It is not clear that Reuben had any plan beyond, I'm going to get him out of the pit. Reuben never says, oh, don't sell him, do X. And we don't know where Reuben is supposed to have gone all this time. The rabbis make up a story because that's what the rabbis do. They make up stories. They make up a story, but they don't have an answer to the question, really. What was Reuben's plan? Why does Reuben say nothing during the cover up? Right? The cover up is always worse than the crime. I don't know if that's true here, but why does Reuben say nothing? What's the plan? How much can you actually do when you don't have answers to everything? And if we think that the Midianites and the Ishmaelites are different people, what's the plan? What were the brothers? What did the brothers plan? They thought, well, we're just going to sit away and we're going to let somebody grab the kid. How come they didn't intervene? So there's all of these questions that are left open. And one of the things that I always encourage people to do when they're reading the Joseph story is to see if you can find this book. I'm not so sure that it's in print very well anymore. It's called In Potiphar's House. It came out at about the time that um, Bill Moyers was doing his Genesis stuff. And this is by a former professor of Jewish studies at Harvard. He is retired and lives in Israel now. And it's just about Joseph, this part of the Joseph story. And he looks at early Jewish sources, early Christian sources, and the Quran, which has a version of this story. Everybody trying to kind of fill in these gaps in the story to fix it because they're worried about all of these gaps. And it sort of points out we have three religious traditions who don't get along so well a lot of the time, and they're all writing fan fiction, essentially, to fill in gaps like are they Ishmaelites or are they Midianites? There are lots of other things to see in this story. Um, this is one of the stories that is very attractive for queer theory as well. Um, we have this stuff about Joseph being a youth. Um, he has this ornamented tunic, tended the flocks with his brothers, but he's described as a youth. And we have some texts that say, well, what does that mean? Because again, what does it mean to be a youth? And it describes things like he decorates his eyes. There is a text that says that he prances. So these classic Jewish texts are trying to figure out what it means to be youth. And apparently, what it means to be a youth when you're a 17-year-old male is to perhaps be Egyptian or perhaps to be what we would recognize as gender nonconforming. in essence. And then you compound it with his dreams. So one of his dreams, he says, "Oh, the sun, the moon, and the stars." And they were all, I was the sun and everyone was bowing down to me. But the other one is we were binding sheaves in the field when suddenly my sheaf stood up and remained upright, and your sheaves gathered around and bowed low to my sheaf, which has the feel of something a little bit Freudian. One's standing up and all the others are bowing down. And what does that mean? And is it just about fertility or is it something else? And he's the youngest one and he's described as being young, which means that he's doing things that, at least according to a lot of traditions, are gender nonconforming. And so here we have this other piece of the narrative. Um, Again, what is it? There are all of these empty spaces we can read into. So this is one of those texts that I think we can actually spend a little bit of time dropping the historicism that we often bring as humanistic Jews who want to say, well, what was the original and how did this get put together and what are the pieces of it? And one, just read the story without fighting with it too much, but two, fight the story literarily instead of fighting the story as a historical exercise to find other things in it. Not everything has to have ethical or historical value necessarily to make a good story, and it can still give you some insight into what's going on with the biblical text. So that's my pitch for you to read this material, by the way, is there are huge gaps in here and there's a lot to fill in, and it is an interesting story. I will tell you that I don't buy the you've maybe heard the idea that the Bible is the greatest story ever told. I don't know if it's the greatest story ever told. It is a big story, and it's a big culturally and historically important story for Jews and for Christians and for Western civilization more generally. And it's important for Islam because it gets refracted through the Quran in lots of different ways. You would not necessarily recognize the Joseph story in the Quran as the one that we know. It's structured differently, but it's there. It's got Midrash and Christian interpretations in it, and it's not the same story anymore. And that's interesting in and of itself. But this is an interesting story so that you can kind of see what happens in the life of a story, as well as just figuring out the story itself, because the story itself is actually somewhat difficult to piece apart and put back together. Um, and I don't want to totally leave Judah and Tamar behind because there's lots of literature about Judah and Tamar. The important thing for understanding what's going on with Judah and Tamar is something called levirate marriage. If you've read the book of Ruth, you've encountered levirate marriage before as well. The book of Ruth doesn't get levirate marriage right on purpose. It's part of the storytelling. This doesn't get levirate marriage right either according to the laws of the Torah, but the point is really not getting the law right as much as it is pointing out a problem with Judah as a character and as a person, and bringing that character into criticism because it redeems Judah later on. The story redeems Judah, and then Judah is redeemed later on as the main tribe that's going to survive beyond, um, that's going to survive the longest in history. And we actually get that clue much later on in Genesis 49. We get this poem that is Jacob blessing his sons right before his death. And Judah's the only one that really gets a nice blessing out of all of this. Um, Sigmund Sternberg married his brother's widow, right? So there are people who do things that are like levirate marriage, but mostly that form of marriage goes away. Um, Over time, people don't mostly do this. Um, and this is very messy because Judah can't actually do levirate marriage for his sons either. It's very strange, but that just sort of tells you how difficult this idea is that you should marry somebody to preserve the progeny of somebody who's died. It's an odd institution. Um, but it also shows how relatively powerless women are in that society. And so it's worth reading just to get a sense for how much of an object Tamar is really treated as in the context of that narrative. So it's worth reading. It's its own separate unit, but it also is illuminating when you take Judah as a character and then take his name and slap it onto a tribe and see what happens succeeding out through other parts of biblical history. So with that, I'm going to just make it so you guys don't have to see my screen anymore. Not that I'm worried that something strange is going to come up on my screen. Uh, that's on the other web browser. That's on the other monitor. We won't have confusion. Um, and I'm happy to talk about stuff or let you go. I've got lots of coffee to keep my head awake, by the way. So I got that too.
Thank you. That was very interesting and raises a lot of questions. Anyone want to jump in? Either just unmute yourself and ask, or put your hand up, or raise your virtual hand.
So I did see that Martin asked a question. Do I buy Genesis Rabbah's explanation that Hagar and Keturah were the same person, Keturah being Midian's mother? Honestly, I think when you try to approach how the rabbis in Midrash Rabbah try to, and it's Rashi. Well, Rashi's getting it from um, Genesis Rabbah. Something people talk about Rashi, this major biblical interpreter. Rashi is almost as much invested in yanking old rabbinic sources forward and claiming that they are the plain sense of the text as he is in explaining the plain sense of the text. Rashi is great footnotes. People who've done PhD work know that you get excited about the footnotes more than you get excited about the text itself. Rashi's footnotes are better than Rashi sometimes. This is, I think, true. Anytime rabbis are trying to give you history, you should be very, very, very suspicious of their historical take on things. I guess including me. That's fine. I'm used to it. You lead a humanistic congregation. Everybody's skeptical of everybody. It's fine. But do I buy Genesis Ravah's explanation? I don't buy Genesis Ravah's explanation for much of anything historical because frankly, who knows? I mean, it's an impenetrable thing because it's too far past anyway, but I think that they're trying to put things together. Again, we're watching them fill their gaps. And that's a lot of what's happening in Midrash is, wow, that bothers us. How do we fill that in? Um, there is an Israeli biblical interpreter that many people know, um, who I sound like Donald Trump there. I don't mean to say many people know. It's that I can't remember her first name. Nechama Leibowitz. I got it. Okay. Nechama Leibowitz wrote a series of books that goes through the weekly Torah portion and pulls out classical commentators like Rashi and whatever else. And Nechama Leibowitz's lodestar, her guiding point for understanding almost anything, is the question, what's bothering Rashi? What's bothering Rashi is usually also what's bothering whatever's in Midrash Rabbah, which in this case is how are they related and how do we get the Ishmaelites to be the same as the Midianites? And they're trying to fill in a gap. Leaping lacunae. It's like it proves my title.
Peter in Astoria, you're on the air.
Hello, hello.
Hey, Peter.
Hi, hi. I'm fascinated by the gaps. It reminded me as sort of a correlation to for instance, some films, classic films that were cut because of time or content, and then over the years restored, trying to fill in those gaps. Sounds familiar? And whether it's Star is Born, which use script or just still pictures or some footage without sound to try to keep the narrative and filling in the narrative. Why did this person do this action, but we don't know because it was cut? On the other side is what we only have now. For instance, just getting a little film nerdy, The Magnificent Ambersons by Orson Welles, which was cut by the studio while he was away, and that's all we have left. There's nothing to restore or find. So just like these stories where the rabbis had an opportunity, it seems, to fill in a gap, there's some stuff we'll never, ever, and so we'll just have to suspend our belief or just go with it. And it's kind of a nice eye opener, not only for my sense of film history, but reading Parshas. So thank you for illuminating that.
Yeah, I love these gap things. They're great. They tell you a lot and you get a lot of literature out of them, which is nice. And frankly, if you happen to be an educator on this call and you happen to educate Jewish people, this is a nice exercise for getting humanistic Jews to think about Midrash in a functional way as compared to what you see in a lot of Midrash, right? It's if you look at the beginning of the book of Genesis, right? How does Genesis start? In a beginning of creating the world, or however you want to translate that very vague phrase, the Hebrew's a mess.
Are we frozen? Well, we're going to give him a minute. Oh no. Has he been turned to stone? Let's see. Do we have a text for him? Hey, Jonathan, how are you?
I'm good,
Um,
Paul.
Jeremy probably is going to sign back on in a moment. You want to wait for him, I presume?
I'll fill the time. It's okay if you want
Oh,
for
here he is. Are you back, Jeremy? I thought I just saw him. Yeah, go ahead, Jonathan. Here he is again.
so that was a nice gap Jeremy provided right there because
Here he
now we
is,
can
Jeremy.
now we can only wonder what he was going to say. And
Yeah, nice gap, Jeremy. That's what
You,
Jonathan.
you know what else? You know who else can only wonder what I was going to say? Me.
so I'll just make two comments as I think Jeremy, thanks so much for your talk. Um, that when I think about the age we live in, and one ties into the Judith and Tamar story in part in connection to what you're saying about dealing with gaps, and that the more people deceive one another, the more gaps we have about what our world is, right? So, when I think of, uh, unexplained, a boat is being shot in the middle of the ocean, but we don't really know why. We can't really trust. So honesty, to some sense, decreases the amount of gaps we have, and dishonesty or lack of trust increases the amount of gaps we have in our knowledge. And I think also when you don't have a lot of knowledge, sometimes you're pulled to wanting a kind of almost a prophetic vision about what's going to come next, right? When you don't know, you want to latch on to something. So this is a story where, okay, we can latch on to, we're going to have the years of famine, we're going to have the years of plenty, and something like that. So I think when we have uncertainty, often we're driven to, rather than, I'll put it in Sherwin Wine's terms, kind of rather than just accepting sort of the randomness of the universe, accepting the things we don't know, we kind of want a story to fill that out sometimes. And living in that uncertainty is an important human function, even if it's a difficult function.
Right, staying sane in a crazy world.
Yeah.
Bruce has his hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to leapfrog on what Jonathan was saying. And, what popped into my mind was that, especially from a humanistic perspective, and in terms of my interest in Musar study, the idea that every gap is an opportunity. And if we look at a gap, an area of uncertainty, it's an opportunity to approach it first with humility, and secondly, with curiosity. So, whether the writers did that intentionally or whether that's just the consequence of their writing style, it seems that gaps, as they're analyzed by rabbis across the world, will illustrate a wide display of virtues from one extreme to the other as far as humility and how people address uncertainty. So I would think that in the, you know, our virtues are on display as we analyze those types of gaps in terms of how we address what we don't know.
Yeah. And there's certainly a lot we don't know. And about ships off the coast of Venezuela, among other things. But I think there's a lot we don't know. And there's a lot that we can draw from context. How many people have seen the Vanity Fair photo essay? So some people are saying no, the Vanity Fair photo essay of Trump's senior advisors. How many people have seen social media tweets making comparisons of the photos?
That I saw.
So there are some tweets and various other postings that have a photo of Marco Rubio looking out one of the windows in the West Wing, and it's a duplication of a photo of Nixon. And there's a photo of Stephen Miller, and it's put next to a photo of Joseph Goebbels, and it's the same head positioning and the same expression. And there's Tom Shavino, I think his first name is Tom, Dan Shavino, who has this very strange kind of undercut hairstyle, and then the hair is swept back and it's from the side, and he has
That's
kind of a
very
round
interesting. I
face.
figured there'd be all kinds of.
And it's put right next to a photo of Himmler. If you don't know the photos that they're keying off of, you just see sinister photos. If you do know the photos that they're keying off of, you see very explicitly what the photographer was doing in an act of photojournalism, but also an act of commentary. What will people know about that if there's no social media and you have no idea that that's what's going on? How do you know how to interpret those photos? When the author, in this case, the photographer, had very direct intent in how those photos were framed. And their comment recently was very interesting. There's a little bit of a little bit from the article itself where this this photographer was asked, "Do you feel like you missed anything, or you lost a shot or something?" And they said no. And they related a conversation with Stephen Miller, saying Stephen Miller was the most concerned about what the photos would look like, and should I smile, should I not smile? Well, let's try them each way, and closed the session with the photographer by saying, in your position, you have a lot of discretion to decide how to be kind to people and whether to be kind to people or not. And the photographer said, and I replied back to him, and so do you. How do you know what's happening in those photos without all that context? So it's not just we know about the world, it is what do we know about the story? What do we know about the motivation? What's going on? So overall, as the takeaway on a typical Friday night family trust, I can't tell you what the typical what the takeaway ought to be. I would tend, because it's probably the easiest thing to get across to kids in particular, I would tend to really focus on the first chapter of this and to talk about the unforeseen circumstances and effects of our behavior. Because here we are looking at, we're going to throw him in this pit. We shouldn't kill him, but we're going to throw him in this pit. We'll figure it out later, but we just don't want him. And then he's sold by Joseph is pulled out of the pit by one person and maybe sold by that person to another set of people who then take him someplace else and he's kidnapped. Or maybe the consequence is that the brothers sell him because they happen to have a moment where they go, "Oh, we can make some money off of this." All of which then leads to a very unforeseen set of circumstances. What are the odds that the kid who's left in a pit is going to be the kid who saves you 40 years down the road? And saves you, by the way, like if you want to really talk about unforeseen circumstances, saves you by being about the most pro-slavery thing you can be. Because the way he saves them is he starts saying to Egyptians, "I'll give you food if you give me your land." And basically buys Egypt for Pharaoh. So, by the way, the next time anybody tells you that the Bible is inherently a democratic book, you can tell them I told you no. And I've got a great example right here in the Joseph story, and many other places. The Bible's not a democratic book. Um, there's a Yiddish word Narishkeit, which means foolishness. That's Narishkeit for you. Um, so that would be my tendency would be to really focus on the first chapter of the book and the unforeseen consequences of pretty much everything we do. Is you don't know. The future's a gap too. Um, Another gap is whether Joseph really did refuse Potiphar's wife or whether that's a male writing it in to excuse him or something. I mean, so that's I've lost the word. It's the title of a book by Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza. Hermeneutic of Suspicion is what it's called, where you go, there's gaps. What really happened here? Right? Like it's literally called the hermeneutic of suspicion. It's in textbooks and I don't know. It was a big deal in the 90s when I was in college. Anyway, I don't know what's happening in biblical studies classrooms now. Hopefully, still that at least. Um, so yeah, is he trying to be is a male writer trying to excuse him? I don't know. He runs out of the place naked. There's at least some kind of a gap showing there. Sorry, I just couldn't let it go, Miriam.
Time for one last question, if anyone has it. Otherwise, I will thank Jeremy so much for this. It's very interesting. It makes me think of all other kinds of gaps as well. I mean, in the secular world, there's a lot of talk of the God of the gaps, right? Where, which is basically religion today. Religion is no longer trying to explain why eclipses happen because we know why eclipses happen. So that's no longer part of religious worship, right? So now God continues to move back because the only gaps we have to fill in are these other questions we can't answer. So it was interesting to hear about how the rabbis may have filled in the gaps in the Joseph story, or just in general how they filled in the gaps in the Torah. So gave us a lot to think about. Thank you so much. And any last words you want to share, Jeremy?
Drink good coffee.
That is excellent advice. And happy Hanukkah, everybody, and happy New Year. And we'll see you in 2026. Thanks
Chag
again.
Sameach.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care, everybody.